Welcome to your deep dive into reclaiming self-worth after divorce. Looks like you've given us a really interesting mix of materials here. We've got personal growth advice from Tiny Buddha, relationship tips, and even some psychological perspectives from Psychology Today. There's even a piece from Reclaiming Your Life and Strengthen Your Marriage. Not exactly what you'd expect, right? But that's the beauty of these deep dives. We get to explore all these different angles and see what clicks for you.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. And you know what's really fascinating is that even with this diverse set of sources, there's a common thread. The idea that divorce, while painful, can be a powerful catalyst for growth. It's not just about picking up the pieces, it's about using this experience to rediscover and redefine yourself.
Okay, I love that. So we're not talking about simply getting over divorce, but about using it as a launch pad for personal transformation.
Exactly. Several sources emphasize that divorce isn't necessarily a failure, but a transition. It's like closing one chapter and stepping into a new one, full of possibilities.
That makes a lot of sense. Holding on to the idea of divorce as a failure would only hold you back. But if you see it as a transition, as a chance to redefine yourself and your life, that's empowering.
And speaking of empowerment, Tina Gilbertson, the psychologist we mentioned earlier, talks about the courage it takes to let go of the familiar, even if it's not serving you anymore. That really resonated with me.
Me too. I think sometimes we stay in situations even when we know they're not right for us, because it feels safer than the unknown. But Gilbertson's point about courage really highlights the strength it takes to step outside that comfort zone and embrace change. What do you think, listener? Have you ever felt that pull between staying in the familiar and taking a leap of faith?
It's a universal struggle, for sure. And Gilbertson doesn't just stop at acknowledging the difficulty of letting go. She also encourages us to grieve the positive aspects of the marriage as part of the healing process.
That's such a great point. We often think of grieving as something we do only when something negative happens, like a death. But there can be a real sense of loss even when we choose to end a relationship.
Absolutely. It's about honoring the good times, the lessons learned, and then allowing ourselves to move on.
So it's about acknowledging those feelings of sadness or loss without letting them dictate your actions. And this is where the Psychology Today article really shines. It goes beyond the typical "don't be sad" advice and offers some practical strategies for navigating those tricky emotions. For example, Gilbertson suggests not letting transient emotions drive your behavior.
Now, transient emotions might sound a bit technical,
Yeah.
but it simply means those feelings that come and go, like waves. It's about recognizing that just because you feel angry or hurt in one moment doesn't mean you need to act on those feelings.
Because, as you said earlier, this is a time of transition and growth. Letting those fleeting emotions dictate your actions could lead you down a path you'll regret later.
Exactly. And this idea of not being ruled by your emotions ties in perfectly with the Tiny Buddha article on valuing yourself in relationships. Marlena Tillion, the author, really emphasizes that you are in control of your own happiness, not your circumstances or other people.
This is huge because it's so easy, especially after a divorce, to feel like your happiness has been taken away from you. But Tillman is saying, wait a minute, you still have the power to choose happiness.
Yes. And choosing happiness sometimes means making tough decisions, like setting boundaries or walking away from situations that no longer serve you.
It's about recognizing your own worth and not settling for less than you deserve. And that brings us to an important point. How does this all play out when children are involved?
The Psychology Today article offers some reassurance here. It emphasizes that divorce doesn't automatically damage children.
That's a big relief, I'm sure, for anyone going through a divorce with kids. But the article also makes it clear that how you divorce matters. It stresses the importance of never speaking ill of the other parent in front of the children.
This can be incredibly damaging and create a loyalty conflict for the child. They're already dealing with the upheaval of their family structure changing. They don't need the added burden of feeling like they have to choose sides.
Absolutely. And this focus on the child's well-being actually connects back to the idea of valuing yourself in relationships. The Tiny Buddha article raises an important question. What happens when we neglect ourselves in a relationship? And Tillon's answer is pretty powerful. She argues that it harms everyone.
And she's not just talking about romantic relationships. This applies to all relationships. When we constantly put our own needs on the back burner, it can breed codependency and resentment.
Codependency, in a nutshell, is when you become so reliant on another person for your emotional well-being that you lose sight of your own identity and needs. And resentment builds when you feel like you're constantly giving without receiving anything in return.
Exactly. And that's a recipe for an unhealthy and ultimately unhappy relationship, whether it's with a partner, a friend, or even a family member.
So, if neglecting ourselves in relationships can have such negative consequences, how do we start reclaiming that sense of self after a divorce? Especially when we might be feeling lost and unsure of who we are without that relationship.
That's where things start to get really interesting. We're moving from understanding the dynamics of divorce and self-worth to exploring some practical steps for rebuilding and reclaiming yourself. And one of the most powerful images that stuck with me comes from the Reclaiming Your Life and Strengthen Your Marriage blog.
Wait, that blog again. The one that seems counterintuitive at first glance.
Yes. It might seem strange to turn to a blog about strengthening marriage when you're going through a divorce, but hear me out. This blog post talks about how a simple daily walk can become a powerful ritual of reclaiming yourself amidst other roles.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. It's not about the walk itself. It's about carving out that time for yourself,
Mhm.
for reconnecting with who you are outside of your role as a spouse, a parent, an employee, or whatever else you might be juggling. And that's something everyone can benefit from, whether you're married, divorced, single, or whatever.
Precisely. And this ties in beautifully with Danielle Bernock's advice. She's a self-worth expert who says that self-care isn't selfish. It's about honoring the treasure chest within you.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. We often feel guilty for taking time for ourselves, like it's indulgent or selfish. But Burnock reframes it as an act of self-respect and self-love.
And she takes it a step further, connecting it to a spiritual perspective.
Yeah.
She says that God values you, so you should too.
It's a powerful reminder that your worth doesn't come from external validation or achievements, but from something much deeper, something inherent within you.
Exactly. And that leads us to another crucial aspect of rebuilding self-worth after a divorce, understanding the difference between internal and external validation. It's a topic that many of our sources touch on, and it's essential for anyone navigating this journey. What's truly fascinating here is how many of these sources emphasize shifting your focus from external validation to internal validation.
That makes sense. After a divorce, it's easy to get caught up in what other people think. Did I make the right decision? Am I failing as a parent? Will people judge me?
It's completely natural to have those thoughts, but what these sources are suggesting is that true self-worth,
Mm.
it can't be found in the opinions of others. It has to come from within.
So instead of looking to our achievements,
Hmm?
our relationship status, or even the number of likes on our latest social media post to tell us we're worthy, we need to cultivate that sense of worthiness from within.
Exactly. And Danielle Bernock, the self-worth expert we mentioned earlier, puts it beautifully. She talks about daring to believe you are worthy of love.
Mm.
Notice, it's not about becoming worthy you already are. It's about daring to believe it.
That's such a subtle but important distinction, and this daring to believe really resonates with what Feminista Jones writes about in her article, No Relationship is Worth Losing Your Sense of Self.
Absolutely. Jones is a fierce advocate for self-love and empowerment. She argues that you should never shrink yourself to fit someone else's mold. A true partner should love your whole self, flaws and all.
So it's not about changing who you are to make someone else happy. It's about finding someone who appreciates and celebrates you for exactly who you are.
And that goes for all relationships, not just romantic ones. Friends, family, colleagues, they should all add to your life, not diminish you.
That makes me think back to when we were talking about neglecting ourselves in relationships. It's like when we shrink ourselves to please others, we're not only doing a disservice to ourselves, but we're also setting a precedent for how we expect to be treated.
Exactly. And it's never too late to change that pattern. Divorce can actually be a powerful opportunity to reclaim those parts of yourself that you may have lost or suppressed in the relationship.
So it's about taking stock of who you are, what you value, and what brings you joy. It's about rediscovering those passions and interests that might have gotten pushed aside during the marriage. Have you ever felt that, listener? Like you had to dim your own light to make space for someone else?
It's a common experience,
Hmm.
unfortunately. But the good news is that you can always reclaim that light. And this is where the shift from external to internal validation becomes so important. When your sense of self-worth is rooted in something solid, something unchanging, it becomes unshakable.
It's like that old saying, what other people think of me is none of my business. But it's hard to live by that, right?
It can be. But with practice, you can start to detach your sense of worth from the opinions of others. And the Psych Central article offers some helpful tips for cultivating that internal validation. For example, they suggest keeping a journal of positive quotes or affirmations, things that remind you of your inherent value.
Almost like an antidote to that negative self-talk we all struggle with from time to time.
Exactly. And the article also emphasizes the importance of surrounding yourself with a positive support system. People who uplift you, who see your worth, even when you might not. Because, let's face it, rebuilding self-worth after a divorce can be challenging. There will be days when you doubt yourself, when you feel lost and alone.
That's when it's crucial to have those people in your corner, cheering you on, reminding you of your strength and resilience.
And speaking of things that can challenge your self-worth,
Yeah.
we can't ignore the elephant in the room, social media.
Oh, yes, social media. The ultimate highlight reel of everyone else's seemingly perfect lives.
As the Psych Central article points out, social media is often a breeding ground for comparison and self-doubt.
It's so easy to get sucked into that vortex of not enough, not thin enough, not rich enough, not happy enough.
And that's why the PositivePsychology.com article emphasizes the importance of mindfulness, especially when it comes to your social media consumption. Being aware of what you're consuming, both online and offline, and how it's affecting your mental and emotional well-being.
I think this is where a lot of us struggle. We mindlessly scroll through our feeds, comparing our lives to those carefully curated images. And it can really mess with our sense of self-worth. How has social media impacted your sense of self-worth, listener? It's a question worth reflecting on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And if you find that social media is doing more harm than good, maybe it's time to take a break. Unfollow those accounts that trigger those feelings of inadequacy, or limit your screen time in general.
That reminds me of a quote I read recently. Comparison is the thief of joy.
That's so true. When we're constantly comparing ourselves to others, we're robbing ourselves of the present moment, of the joy of simply being.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about reframing divorce as a transition, the importance of internal validation over external validation, the need to cultivate self-love and self-worth, and the impact of social media on our mental well-being.
It's all connected, right? It all comes back to that core idea of recognizing your inherent worth and building a life that reflects that worth.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you navigate this chapter of your life? How do you take all this information and turn it into something actionable, something that will actually make a difference in your day-to-day life?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. So we talked about all these great ideas, from reframing divorce to recognizing your inherent worth. But I think what you're really looking for are those concrete steps you can take right now to start feeling better.
You're absolutely right. It's not enough to just understand these concepts intellectually. We need to put them into practice.
Exactly.
And luckily for us, a lot of these articles actually offer some really practical advice. For example, remember that Tiny Buddha article we talked about earlier, the one about self-care?
The one by Marlena Tilhan. Yes. She talks about making a conscious choice to prioritize your well-being, even if it's just for a few minutes each day.
Yeah, I love how she emphasizes that self-care isn't selfish. It's about recognizing that you're worth that time and attention. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy or elaborate. It could be as simple as taking a walk, like the woman in that Reclaiming Your Life blog we discussed.
Or it could be something completely different, like listening to your favorite music, taking a long bath, reading a good book, or spending time in nature. What matters is that it feels nourishing and restorative to you.
So it's about tuning into yourself and figuring out what you need in that moment. It's about giving yourself permission to prioritize your own well-being. Which brings us to another important concept that several of these articles touch on, self-compassion.
Self-compassion. This is such a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And one that many of us struggle with.
I know I do. It's so much easier to be kind and understanding to others than it is to be kind to ourselves.
It's a common human tendency. But remember what Kristen Neff, the self-compassion researcher, says. It's not about letting yourself off the hook. It's about recognizing that you're human, that you're going to make mistakes. And that's okay.
It's about treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a dear friend.
Exactly. So instead of beating yourself up over a mistake or a setback, try to approach it with curiosity and compassion. Ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can I do better next time?
That's such a more constructive approach, and it ties in with the idea of taking responsibility for our own happiness, which we talked about earlier.
It's about recognizing that while we can't control everything that happens to us, we can control how we respond. We can choose to focus on the positive, to look for the good, even in difficult situations.
And to remember that our worth doesn't depend on those external circumstances.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. All of these sources, in their own way,
Mhm.
are pointing to the fact that building self-worth starts within. It's about recognizing your inherent value,
Mm.
independent of what's happening in your life right now.
And that's a lifelong journey. It's not something you achieve overnight. But every step you take towards self-compassion, towards self-care, towards recognizing your worth, is a step in the right direction.
Beautifully put. And remember, divorce, while incredibly difficult, can be a catalyst for this journey of self-discovery. It can be a chance to redefine yourself on your own terms, to create a life that truly reflects who you are and what you value.
It sounds like you're on the right track, digging into these different perspectives and really trying to understand what resonates with you. So I'm curious, what single action from these articles feels most doable for you right now? What's one small step you can take today to honor your worth and move towards a happier, more fulfilling life? Pick one and make it happen. You're worth it.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode. If you found this conversation helpful or relatable, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others who might benefit from it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update